Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a quirky but fascinating topic that's been perplexing historians for centuries. Why did the Egyptians never eat dog meat? Imagine this. You're strolling through the golden sands of ancient Egypt, the sun beating down as you hear the soft padding of paws in the background. It's a dog. But here's the kicker, while dogs were everywhere in Egypt, they were never served up for dinner. In fact, dogs were seen as sacred and important figures. Sounds odd, right? You probably won't survive this one without raising an eyebrow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest question on the table. Why on earth did the Egyptians avoid eating dogs? We know that ancient Egyptians weren't exactly vegetarian, right? They consumed a variety of meats, from fish to birds to even the occasional cow. But despite having all sorts of animals around them, including man's best friend, dogs were not seen as a source of food. So, what's going on here? Historians still argue about the primary reasons behind this, but one thing's for sure, dogs weren't viewed as mere pets, they were almost divine beings. To understand why the Egyptians never tucked into dog stew, we need to start by looking at how deeply integrated animals were in Egyptian religion and culture. And no, I'm not just talking about cats, although we'll definitely get to that. Let's talk about the sacred symbolism of animals in Egypt and how that might have led to the sacred status of dogs. Now, take a moment to picture this. You're walking through the bustling streets of Thebes or Cairo, the ancient city filled with towering monuments and sacred temples. Everywhere you look, animals hold a special place. The Egyptians didn't just see animals as companions, they believed animals were physical representations of gods. The connection between animals and divinity was undeniable. In fact, the animals that the Egyptians revered were often seen as symbols of different aspects of life and death, the physical and spiritual. For example, cats were revered as protectors, specifically against evil spirits. And don't even get me started on the bulls and cows, which represented strength and fertility. But, where do dogs fit into all of this? Well, dogs were seen as sacred in a different way. Unlike the way we think of pets today, dogs in ancient Egypt were often viewed as protectors of the home, loyal guardians. But there was something else, too. Dogs had a unique role in Egyptian religion, especially when it came to the afterlife. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about their spiritual significance. Enter the god Anubis. Anubis was the god of the afterlife, and guess what? He was often depicted with the head of a jackal, which was closely related to the dog family. Anubis guided souls to the afterlife and protected them on their journey. Can you imagine the reverence for dogs when your spiritual guide looked just like one? They weren't just animals, they were seen as protectors of the soul, as sacred intermediaries between the living and the dead. That's some serious status for a creature that we would just throw a ball for today, right? Historians still argue whether this sacred role was the primary reason dogs weren't eaten or if it was tied more to their role as guardians and companions. But what's clear is that the Egyptians didn't see dogs as mere livestock. They were too important, too sacred to be viewed as a food source. So, before we jump into how this view influenced their dietary habits, let's take a closer look at the other animals that made it to the dinner table. Now that we've gotten a sense of why dogs had such a revered status in Egypt, let's turn our attention to the bigger picture. What exactly did the Egyptians eat? And why didn't they include dogs on the menu? The ancient Egyptians were anything but picky eaters, so this omission is all the more curious. The Egyptians were known for their diverse diet, which included a mix of plant-based foods and animal protein. Fish, for instance, was abundant due to the Nile River, and they also consumed a variety of fowl. Geese, ducks, and pigeons were common on their plates. They even ate beef, though it wasn't as frequently consumed as you might think. This was mainly because cattle were more valuable as working animals and symbols of wealth than as dinner fare. But here's where it gets interesting. The Egyptians, despite their consumption of many animals, avoided dogs. So why didn't they treat dogs like other animals? One explanation could be that dogs were not bred for food. Unlike pigs, goats, and cattle, which were specifically domesticated for meat, dogs were more suited to roles as protectors, hunters, and companions. They were useful in ways that went far beyond the dinner plate. Think of them as the ancient Egyptian version of a guard dog or a police dog. These animals were valued for their loyalty and utility, not their taste. But, there's more to it than just practicalities. Egyptians had a strong belief in the balance of nature and the divine order of things. The gods, as we've seen with Anubis, were always part of the conversation when it came to any decision regarding animals. Dogs, being tied so closely to Anubis and the afterlife, may have been seen as part of the cosmic balance that couldn't be disrupted. To kill and eat a dog might be seen as an affront to the gods and the spiritual order. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' avoidance of dog meat was entirely rooted in religious beliefs or if it was also a reflection of practical concerns regarding the role of dogs. But what we do know is that these loyal companions were kept around not for their meat but for their protection, their spiritual connection, and their roles as guardians of the home. This reverence likely extended far beyond any utilitarian purpose. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what about other ancient cultures? Were they just as reverent with their dogs? Let's see if we can draw some comparisons to how other civilizations viewed dogs, and whether or not they shared the same "no dog meat" rule. Before we dive into how other cultures handled their dogs, let's take a deeper look at the role that dogs played in ancient Egypt. They were so much more than just pets, they were spiritual guardians. And when you look at it from that angle, the idea of eating a dog seems almost sacrilegious. Picture this: you're standing in front of one of the great Egyptian temples, surrounded by statues of gods and divine beings. You see hieroglyphics detailing rituals, and in many of them, dogs appear as protectors. They weren't just hanging around the temple, they were actively involved in some of the most sacred rituals, often by the sides of priests and royalty. Dogs were believed to protect the divine, so eating them would have been like turning on your spiritual shield. Consider also how dogs were depicted in ancient Egyptian art. Unlike other animals, which might have been shown as offerings to the gods, dogs were often portrayed as loyal companions, sometimes even in royal tombs. In fact, Egyptian pharaohs were often buried with their dogs, a clear indication that these animals were not just temporary companions but lifelong partners. There's something incredibly touching about the idea that these dogs would journey with their masters into the afterlife, ready to protect them on their eternal voyage. To the Egyptians, eating a dog wasn't just an issue of food, there was the weight of centuries of spiritual belief attached to it. If a dog was linked to the divine, how could it possibly become a meal? A meal was something that would sustain your body in the physical world, but dogs were seen as connectors between the physical and spiritual realms. The reverence for them was almost as if eating a dog would be akin to cutting off a bridge to the afterlife itself. It's a mind-bending thought when you consider the utilitarian nature of food in most ancient cultures. This idea of spiritual reverence runs through many aspects of Egyptian society. The Egyptians were so meticulous in the way they viewed the natural world around them. In their minds, every creature had a divine purpose, a role to play in maintaining balance. To eat a dog would mean disrupting that balance, and that was a line they weren't willing to cross. So, while the Egyptians had plenty of food choices, the decision to avoid dogs was likely linked to much deeper concerns than just taste or practicality. Now, let's take a moment to compare the Egyptian treatment of dogs with that of other ancient civilizations. What about the Greeks and Romans? Did they eat dogs, or did they share Egypt's sacred view of our four-legged friends? You might be surprised by what you find. In ancient Greece, for example, dogs were highly regarded, particularly in myth. Greek mythology is full of famous canine figures, such as Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of the underworld. But despite the reverence for dogs and their spiritual beliefs, the Greeks did not hold the same taboo against eating them as the Egyptians did. In fact, some Greek texts mention dog meat as a food source, particularly in regions where resources were scarce. This stands in stark contrast to the Egyptians, where no such mention exists. And then there's Rome, the great empire that spanned much of Europe and beyond. Romans, like the Greeks, had a more utilitarian view of animals. While dogs were kept as pets and guard animals, there were instances where dog meat was consumed. Romans were more focused on survival and practicality when it came to food, and in times of famine, almost anything was fair game, including dogs. This starkly contrasts with the Egyptian approach, where sacredness and spirituality trumped the practical need for food. Historians still debate whether the practice of eating dogs in certain ancient societies was based purely on necessity or whether it reflected a lack of spiritual reverence for the animals. The Egyptians, on the other hand, combined practical and spiritual considerations in a way that made dogs untouchable as a food source. The bottom line here is that Egypt's attitude toward dogs was one of deep reverence, and that reverence extended to their treatment in society. Dogs were treated as spiritual beings, not food sources. While other civilizations might have taken a more practical approach, the Egyptians took an almost otherworldly stance on their canine companions. This creates an interesting debate in modern times, when views on eating dogs have evolved, or in some places, completely reversed, due to cultural shifts. As we move forward, we'll see how the ancient Egyptian spiritual relationship with dogs might have shaped their entire diet and culture. And as we consider the sacred role dogs played in Egyptian society, it makes sense that the idea of eating them would be far removed from their daily lives. But, let's take a closer look at the other animals they did eat and how those choices were influenced by their deeply held beliefs. Now that we've explored the spiritual significance of dogs in ancient Egypt, let's move on to how dogs were regarded in relation to other animals Egyptians did eat. Their diet, as we've already touched on, wasn't as restrictive as you might think. Sure, they had a complex relationship with many animals, but they also enjoyed a wide range of meats, many of which were tied to both practical and ritualistic purposes. So what makes dogs different? First off, the Egyptians weren't shy about indulging in meat. As we know, the Nile River provided an abundant source of fish, which was a staple in the Egyptian diet. Fish, such as perch, tilapia, and catfish, were commonly consumed, particularly because they were so readily available. They also ate a lot of poultry, ducks, geese, and pigeons were common fare. These birds were both raised for their meat and used in religious rituals, particularly the sacrificial kind. But what about larger animals? Egypt wasn't exactly known for its vast cattle herds, but they did keep cattle for farming and symbolic purposes. Bullocks were prized for their strength and were used to plow fields or pull carts. However, these animals weren't typically slaughtered for meat unless they were nearing the end of their working life. Beef was a luxury, and consuming it was likely reserved for special occasions or for the elite. In the context of meat consumption, the Egyptians' avoidance of dog meat becomes clearer when we consider the hierarchy of their animals. Cattle and poultry were part of the food chain, but they also served functional purposes, cattle for work and status, birds for both sustenance and ritual. Meanwhile, dogs were neither status symbols nor work animals in the same way. They were guardians, companions, and spiritual protectors. Their role was far too important to be reduced to a mere food source. Moreover, Egyptians were known to carefully regulate their diet to maintain balance and health, which brings us to a fascinating tidbit about their food culture. They believed that what you consumed could directly affect your spiritual and physical well-being. Meat consumption was regulated by class and ritual, and certain meats were believed to be purer or more beneficial than others. For instance, fish was considered a clean food, and it was often associated with fertility and life-giving properties, while other meats like beef or pork were sometimes seen as more base or less spiritually elevated. And here's where things get even more interesting. While eating beef or pork didn't come with the same spiritual significance as eating dog meat, the consumption of certain meats was still heavily tied to religion. Ancient Egyptians made offerings to their gods, which sometimes included animals. These offerings were meant to show respect and maintain balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. The fact that dogs weren't included in these offerings, even as symbolic sacrifices, further underscores their sacred status in Egyptian culture. But this wasn't just about the physical world. The idea of purity and spiritual cleanliness permeated Egyptian society in ways we're still trying to fully understand. To eat a dog, an animal that was believed to protect the soul and guide people through the afterlife, would have been seen as an act of disrespect, perhaps even a cosmic mistake. It would upset the delicate balance between the living and the divine. Now, looking at all of this, it's clear that the Egyptians treated their diet with great care and reverence. Meat was more than just sustenance, it was tied to status, purity, and spiritual well-being. Dogs were revered not for their meat, but for their divine role in the afterlife and their guardianship of the living. But that doesn't mean other animals didn't play roles in Egyptian food culture. In fact, they were seen as part of the ecosystem, contributing to the balance of the world. Still, the dog was a category all its own, never to be viewed as food, but always as a guide to the afterlife and a companion for the living. Historians still argue about how much of this avoidance of dogs as a food source was due to their role in the afterlife versus their role in daily life as protectors and helpers. But one thing is clear, their spiritual significance overshadowed any practical consideration of them as food. Dogs were much more valuable in their spiritual and societal roles than they ever could have been as food on the table. And this distinction is what made Egyptian culture so unique in its approach to animals, particularly the dog. But, this ancient reverence doesn't stop at the Nile. Let's take a look at how the Egyptians' cultural reverence for animals might have influenced how dogs were regarded in other parts of the world, especially in places with radically different traditions and beliefs. So, now that we've established how dogs were viewed in ancient Egypt, as divine guardians, companions, and spiritual intermediaries, let's turn our gaze to other cultures and their attitudes toward dog meat. After all, ancient Egypt wasn't the only civilization with unique dietary taboos and spiritual beliefs surrounding animals. How did other ancient societies approach dogs, and did they share the Egyptians' reverence for these creatures, or did they take a different view entirely? In ancient Greece, dogs held a respected place in society, but not in the same way as in Egypt. Greek mythology is full of canine figures like Cerberus, the multi-headed dog who guarded the gates of the underworld. The Greeks saw dogs as loyal protectors, much like the Egyptians did. But there was a significant difference. The Greeks didn't have the same spiritual, sacred reverence for dogs that the Egyptians did. In fact, the Greeks were far more pragmatic when it came to food. Dogs, while respected, were not treated with the same divine status. When it comes to eating dogs, there's evidence to suggest that the Greeks were far less concerned with a spiritual taboo. While they didn't make a habit of consuming dog meat, it was not unheard of in certain areas during times of scarcity. For instance, there are accounts of people eating dog meat in times of war or famine, when survival trumped any spiritual concern. But this was not a widespread practice by any means. The Greeks were more likely to consume sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle, animals that were more commonly raised for food. Despite their affection for dogs, they were not treated as sacred beings in the same way they were in Egypt. The Romans, on the other hand, were even more practical when it came to their animals. Romans were notorious for their pragmatic approach to life. Animals were often viewed through a lens of utility. Did they serve a function? Were they a source of labor or food? As a result, dogs were primarily kept as hunting companions, pets, and protectors. But again, unlike the Egyptians, dogs weren't viewed as spiritual guardians, they were seen more as useful animals. In fact, there are historical records of Roman communities eating dog meat during periods of scarcity. Dog meat was even considered a delicacy in some parts of the empire. This approach highlights a major cultural divide between the Egyptians and the Romans. While the Egyptians held dogs in a spiritual and sacred light, the Romans were more willing to view them as just another animal in the food chain, especially when resources were scarce. The Romans' utilitarian view of animals, including dogs, contrasted sharply with the Egyptians' more mystical and protective view. This difference could be rooted in the cultural values of both civilizations. The Romans were focused on expansion, conquest, and practicality, while the Egyptians were deeply invested in spiritual balance, reverence for life, and the afterlife. Let's take a brief detour and look at some other ancient civilizations that had different attitudes toward dogs. In China, for example, dogs were often viewed as loyal companions and protectors, similar to their role in Egypt. However, there's also a long history of dog meat consumption in certain regions of China, especially during times of war or hardship. Unlike the Egyptians, who viewed dogs as sacred creatures, the Chinese didn't have the same religious taboo against eating them. Instead, they were more likely to see them as a food source during desperate times. This stark contrast in cultural perspectives can be traced back to the way dogs were perceived in each society. The Egyptians placed them in a spiritual realm, while others viewed them more as a commodity. In Africa, some indigenous tribes practiced a similar reverence for dogs, seeing them as protectors and companions. However, there were also instances where certain cultures in Africa would consume dog meat, often in ritualistic contexts or during times of famine. Again, the role of the dog in the social and spiritual fabric of these cultures varied greatly. In some cases, dogs were revered and protected, while in others, they were considered food in specific cultural or economic situations. Now, this cultural variation in dog consumption speaks volumes about how different societies viewed their relationship with animals. For the Egyptians, the sacred role of the dog as a spiritual guide and guardian of the afterlife made eating them unthinkable. Their relationship with dogs transcended the material world and entered the realm of the divine. But for other cultures, the pragmatic view of survival often outweighed any spiritual considerations. Eating a dog was sometimes a matter of necessity rather than sacrilege. The Egyptians, by contrast, took their reverence to a whole new level. Their gods were intimately connected to the natural world, and animals like dogs played key roles in the sacred rituals that defined their civilization. The role of dogs as spiritual guides was so important that it elevated them beyond being just companions or protectors. they were intermediaries between the living and the divine. To eat one would have disrupted the delicate balance between the spiritual and physical worlds, and in Egyptian society, that was simply not a line they were willing to cross. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' avoidance of dog meat was purely religious, or if it also had practical implications based on their treatment of animals in general. But whatever the reason, one thing is clear: dogs were too sacred, too important, to be consumed. This cultural distinction between Egypt and other civilizations underscores the profound spiritual connection the Egyptians had with their animals, especially their canine companions. As we move forward, it's important to reflect on the profound connection between animals and the afterlife in Egyptian society. The Egyptians didn't just live in the present, they were deeply concerned with what happened after death. For them, the afterlife was a continuation of life, but on a different, spiritual plane. And in this world of the dead, dogs had a significant role. This connection between dogs and the afterlife is where things get truly fascinating. As we've mentioned before, Anubis, the god of the afterlife, was depicted with the head of a jackal or dog. Anubis was the protector of graves and the god who guided souls through the perilous journey to the afterlife. He was the one who ensured that the dead were properly prepared for their journey, and he watched over the mummification process. Now imagine this: a dog, a creature that shares a deep symbolic connection with Anubis, is seen as a guide to the afterlife. To consume such an animal would not just be an act of eating, it would be an act of desecration. In ancient Egypt, dogs were believed to possess spiritual significance, and this belief extended beyond just their roles as protectors. The Egyptians thought that animals, including dogs, had a sort of spiritual essence that connected them to the divine. Dogs were seen as sacred beings that could help maintain the balance between life and death, as well as protect the living from evil spirits. So when you consider that dogs were associated with a god who governed the afterlife, you start to understand just how untouchable they were. These animals were not just companions, they were revered for their spiritual power and their connection to the divine. The relationship between dogs and the afterlife in Egyptian culture is particularly evident in the burial practices of the time. The Egyptians often buried their beloved pets, including dogs, with their owners. This wasn't a simple burial of a pet, it was a spiritual act. By ensuring that their dogs were buried alongside them, Egyptians believed that they would continue to provide protection and guidance in the afterlife. These funerary practices weren't just symbolic, they were viewed as necessary to ensure that the soul of the deceased was properly cared for in the next life. Imagine a high-ranking Egyptian official preparing for his journey to the afterlife. He's surrounded by treasures, but the most precious item he has is his dog, buried alongside him to protect his soul in the spiritual realm. To the Egyptians, this wasn't just a nice gesture, it was an essential part of ensuring a safe journey. Eating a dog, which had such a profound connection to the afterlife, would have been unimaginable. It wasn't just a matter of dietary preferences, it was a matter of ensuring that the spiritual balance was maintained. Historians still debate the full extent of the Egyptians' beliefs surrounding animals, especially dogs. Some argue that the spiritual and religious significance of animals like dogs was so profound that they could never be reduced to food. Others suggest that the Egyptians may have also avoided eating dogs because of the sheer cultural taboo against eating sacred creatures. What is clear, however, is that the Egyptians held their dogs in high esteem, and that reverence went far beyond anything we might consider today. Interestingly, this connection between dogs and the afterlife wasn't just limited to Egypt. In other ancient cultures, dogs also had spiritual roles, although they were not always as deeply tied to the afterlife. In some cultures, dogs were seen as protectors of the home, while in others, they were believed to have the ability to communicate with the spirits. Yet, In no other culture did dogs hold the same symbolic weight in the afterlife as they did in Egypt. For the Egyptians, the dog was not just a pet, it was a bridge to the spiritual world, a guide through the mysteries of life and death. As we continue exploring this fascinating cultural divide, we'll look at how these beliefs shaped the Egyptians' dietary practices and their view of animals in general. But let's pause for a moment to reflect on just how extraordinary this relationship was. Dogs, for the Egyptians, were not just animals, they were key players in a grand, cosmic narrative that spanned both the physical and spiritual realms. To eat a dog was, in a sense, to disrupt that narrative. It was not just a dietary choice, it was a violation of the sacred order that governed Egyptian society. Historians still argue over whether the Egyptians' avoidance of dog meat was purely due to religious beliefs or whether it was rooted in a broader cultural understanding of animals' roles in their world. But one thing remains clear, dogs were sacred beings, too important to be viewed as food. And that respect for the canine species marked a key difference between Egyptian culture and that of other ancient civilizations. As we move forward, we'll see how this deep reverence for animals played a role in shaping the Egyptians' broader approach to food, ritual, and even their societal hierarchy. We've already seen how the Egyptians viewed dogs as sacred guardians, companions, and spiritual guides. But now let's zoom out a little and explore how these beliefs influenced the way dogs were treated in the broader context of Egyptian society, particularly when it came to their role in rituals and the afterlife. As we know, the ancient Egyptians had a deep obsession with the afterlife. It wasn't just about living well, it was about living eternally. Everything the Egyptians did, from their daily actions to their grand architectural feats, was deeply connected to their belief in life after death. This view was so central to their existence that it permeated every aspect of their culture, including how they treated animals. When you think about the afterlife in Egyptian culture, it's hard to ignore the prominent role of animals. Dogs, in particular, weren't just companions for the living, they were believed to have an essential role in the journey to the afterlife. The famous god Anubis, who we've mentioned before, was the god of mummification and the protector of tombs. His role as the guide to the afterlife elevated the spiritual status of dogs, particularly jackals, which were often associated with him. It wasn't just about the physical protection of the body, but also about ensuring the soul's safe passage into the afterlife. This belief wasn't just a passing idea, it was a central tenet of Egyptian religion. But what does this mean for the everyday Egyptian? Well, as much as dogs were seen as protectors and spiritual guides, their role didn't end with death. Dogs were often involved in rituals that helped ensure the living were protected, too. For example, many tombs contained images of dogs guarding the deceased, and some inscriptions even mention dogs accompanying the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. This close connection between dogs and the afterlife, paired with their role as guardians, meant that eating a dog would be seen as a form of disrespect to the spiritual order. In fact, the more you learn about Egyptian burial practices, the clearer it becomes just how integral dogs were to the spiritual rituals of the time. They weren't simply included as pets in the tomb, they were seen as necessary guides for the soul's journey. If you think about it, this is a little like having a trusted companion by your side during a long, treacherous journey. Except, this journey wasn't to the next town or across the seas, it was to the afterlife, a place where your soul's safety was paramount. But dogs weren't just companions in death, they were also vital to the Egyptians' beliefs surrounding spiritual protection during life. Dogs were often kept around temples and royal courts as protectors. Their role was not just to guard physical property, but to ward off evil spirits and protect the sanctity of the sacred spaces. This divine association meant that they had a far greater purpose than just serving as household pets. They were guardians of purity, and for an ancient society as spiritually attuned as the Egyptians, this role could not be overestimated. One interesting aspect of Egyptian religion is how they often incorporated dogs into their sacred ceremonies, especially in connection with Anubis and mummification rituals. During these ceremonies, dogs were often seen as symbolizing the safe passage of the deceased to the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that dogs' loyalty was a reflection of their spiritual purity. A dog's job was to protect both the living and the dead, making them too important to be consumed. Instead, they were revered as divine protectors who had no place on the dinner table. Now, let's take a step back and think about the role dogs played in other parts of the world. In ancient cultures like those in Greece and Rome, dogs were also regarded as loyal and protective animals. But while they had their spiritual significance, they didn't carry the same sacred weight as they did in Egypt. In fact, in certain places, eating dog meat was common, especially in times of famine or desperation. In ancient Greece, dogs were more often seen as working animals, and while they weren't necessarily treated as sacred, they were certainly valued for their loyalty and protective nature. The Romans were a bit more pragmatic. They did not view dogs through a spiritual lens the way the Egyptians did. In fact, Roman culinary texts mention dog meat as a delicacy in some regions of the empire. This highlights the massive cultural difference between Egypt and other parts of the ancient world when it came to the treatment of dogs. While the Egyptians saw dogs as spiritual beings tied to the divine, the Greeks and Romans were more likely to see them as animals that served practical functions, whether that was guarding the home, hunting, or even providing food when necessary. This cultural divergence underscores the unique spiritual relationship Egyptians had with their dogs. The act of consuming dog meat was more than just a dietary choice, it was a violation of the sacred balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. For the Egyptians, dogs were more than animals, they were divine protectors who ensured safe passage through life and into the afterlife. The idea of eating such a creature was simply unthinkable. The belief that dogs were too sacred to be eaten became an integral part of Egyptian cultural identity. It wasn't just a religious belief, it was a societal norm. Eating dogs would have been seen as an act of sacrilege, something that could disrupt the spiritual harmony of the universe. This cultural perspective on dogs persisted for centuries, influencing how future generations would view the sacred role of animals in their societies. Historians continue to debate the true reasons behind the Egyptian avoidance of dog meat, but what's clear is that the reverence for dogs was rooted in both their spiritual and practical significance. They were protectors of the home, guardians of the afterlife, and spiritual intermediaries who bridged the gap between the living and the divine. For the Egyptians, eating a dog wasn't just a matter of food, it was a matter of maintaining the cosmic balance. Now that we've explored the deep spiritual significance of dogs in Egyptian culture, it's time to take a closer look at how this belief shaped their treatment of animals in general, and why they likely avoided consuming any animal that held a similar sacred role. The reverence Egyptians had for animals wasn't just limited to dogs, it extended across a wide range of species, each with its own symbolic and spiritual significance. One of the most important principles in Egyptian religion was the concept of Ma'at, which represented order, balance, and harmony in the universe. This principle wasn't just about human behavior, it extended to the natural world as well. Animals, in the Egyptian worldview, were key players in maintaining this cosmic balance. The Egyptians saw the natural world as an extension of the divine, where every living being had a specific role to play. This idea didn't just apply to gods or humans, it applied to animals, too. Take, for example, the revered cow. Cows were symbols of fertility, strength, and even motherhood in Egyptian culture. They were often associated with the goddess Hathor, who was the goddess of love, beauty, and motherhood. Cows were not only valuable for their milk and labor, but they also held deep spiritual significance. Like dogs, cows were viewed as divine beings in some ways, and their role in Egyptian society went far beyond mere sustenance. Interestingly, the reverence for cows was matched by the Egyptians' respect for other animals like crocodiles, falcons, and even hippos. Each of these creatures had a specific place in Egyptian mythology, and their spiritual importance transcended their role as food. Crocodiles, for instance, were associated with the god Sobek, who was the god of the Nile and of fertility. Hippos were linked to the goddess Tauret, who was the protector of women and children. These animals were not consumed lightly, even though they were present in Egyptian society. This cultural distinction between animals that were revered and those that were consumed was deeply ingrained in Egyptian life. Eating an animal that was seen as sacred, like a dog, was simply unthinkable because it would have disturbed the balance of Ma'at. The Egyptians didn't just view animals as physical beings, they saw them as spiritual entities that had a role in maintaining harmony between the human and divine worlds. To consume such an animal would be to break the sacred bond between the physical and spiritual realms, and that was something the Egyptians would not tolerate. But here's where things get even more interesting. While the Egyptians had such a profound respect for animals, they also had a pragmatic side to their diet. They understood the importance of meat for survival, especially in times of scarcity. While they didn't eat dogs, they still consumed a variety of meats, including fish, birds, and even cattle on occasion. But the key difference is that these animals didn't have the same spiritual or divine significance as dogs. Cattle, for example, were valued for their strength and utility, but they weren't viewed as divine protectors or spiritual guides. In fact, the Egyptians were very strategic about what animals they consumed and how they did so. The Nile provided a steady supply of fish, which were a staple in the Egyptian diet. Fish were seen as a clean and purifying food, and their consumption was associated with fertility and abundance. Birds, such as ducks, geese, and pigeons, were also common sources of protein, but they were consumed for practical reasons, not spiritual ones. Unlike dogs, these animals were not regarded as intermediaries between the living and the dead. The relationship between the Egyptians and their animals, however, wasn't purely spiritual, it was also based on practicality. Animals like cattle were used for farming, labor, and even as a sign of wealth. The elite had access to these animals, and their consumption was seen as a luxury. In contrast, dogs were not kept for their utility as livestock. They weren't bred for food or labor in the same way other animals were, which made their role in Egyptian society even more unique. So, what does this tell us about the Egyptians' view on dogs and meat consumption? It's clear that their avoidance of eating dogs wasn't just about taste or necessity, it was about the profound spiritual and symbolic role that dogs played in their society. Dogs were protectors, guides, and intermediaries to the afterlife. To consume a dog would have been not only disrespectful but spiritually disruptive. The balance of Ma'at would have been thrown into disarray, and that's a risk the Egyptians weren't willing to take. Historians continue to debate the full extent of this cultural taboo, and while there's no definitive answer, what's clear is that the Egyptians' relationship with dogs was deeply rooted in spirituality. Their role in the afterlife, their connection to Anubis, and their role as protectors and companions all made them sacred creatures in the eyes of the ancient Egyptians. This sacred status extended far beyond the physical realm, and the Egyptians' refusal to consume dog meat was a reflection of their belief in maintaining spiritual and cosmic harmony. As we look back on this unique aspect of Egyptian culture, we can't help but appreciate the way their worldview influenced their diet and their treatment of animals. The Egyptians saw their animals as part of a larger, divine system, and dogs, in particular, held a place of honor and reverence. This cultural respect for animals, especially dogs, set Egypt apart from other ancient civilizations, where the consumption of dog meat was more common. For the Egyptians, eating a dog was never just about survival, it was about preserving the spiritual balance that governed their entire worldview. As we continue our journey through the fascinating world of ancient Egypt, let's reflect on how their deeply ingrained spiritual beliefs affected their everyday lives, particularly when it came to the treatment of animals. Egypt's reverence for dogs wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a broader cultural framework that extended to all aspects of their society, from religion to agriculture to the way they viewed life and death. The Egyptians viewed the natural world as a reflection of the divine. Every aspect of their environment, from the Nile River to the animals that roamed it, was connected to their gods. The importance of balance, harmony, and respect for nature was woven into the fabric of their society. This worldview not only influenced their diet but also shaped their social practices, religious rituals, and even their governance. Animals, like dogs, were integral to this system, and their sacred status was a reflection of the Egyptians' belief that everything in the natural world had a divine purpose. Now, let's dive into a particularly fascinating aspect of Egyptian culture: how dogs were incorporated into their art and literature. Dogs were frequently depicted in Egyptian artwork, often as symbols of loyalty, protection, and spiritual guardianship. You can find images of dogs painted on tombs, guarding the deceased or sitting by their master's sides. These artistic representations were not just decorative, they were meant to ensure that the spirit of the dog would continue to provide protection in the afterlife. In fact, dogs were often included in royal tombs. Pharaohs, the ruling class, believed that the dogs they buried with them would continue to serve as guardians in the next life. These burial practices were not unique to Egypt. Many ancient civilizations placed great importance on the afterlife and took care to ensure that their loved ones, and even their animals, were properly equipped for the journey to the next world. But the Egyptians' particular reverence for dogs was rooted in their belief that these animals had a spiritual connection to the gods, and to Anubis in particular. Anubis was the god of mummification and the protector of tombs. He was associated with dogs and jackals, animals that were believed to have a special role in guarding the dead and guiding their souls to the afterlife. Anubis' divine connection to dogs elevated them to a status far beyond that of mere pets. To the Egyptians, dogs were not just companions, they were sacred beings with an essential role in maintaining the cosmic balance between life and death. This reverence for dogs also extended to their symbolic use in Egyptian rituals. Dogs were often included in religious ceremonies, particularly those related to death and burial. They were seen as spiritual intermediaries who could help the deceased navigate the dangerous and uncertain journey to the afterlife. This symbolic role was so powerful that the mere presence of a dog in an Egyptian tomb could be seen as a guarantee of protection for the soul of the departed. It's easy to see how such deep spiritual beliefs would have influenced the Egyptians' dietary choices. In a culture where animals were seen as divine messengers or guardians, eating a dog would have been viewed as an act of spiritual desecration. It wasn't just about food, it was about maintaining the balance between the physical world and the spiritual world. The Egyptians were deeply attuned to the idea that every action, every decision, could have spiritual consequences. And eating a dog would have had profound spiritual implications, disrupting the sacred relationship between the living and the divine. The connection between dogs and the afterlife is one of the most intriguing aspects of Egyptian belief. Dogs were not just physical creatures, they were viewed as part of the divine order that governed the universe. Their role in the afterlife was so significant that the idea of consuming them would have been unthinkable. They were seen as sacred beings who held the power to protect the soul and ensure safe passage to the next life. Now, you might be wondering, why did the Egyptians place such high importance on animals like dogs when other civilizations, such as the Romans or Greeks, were more utilitarian in their approach? The answer lies in the unique spiritual framework that the Egyptians created, where every element of life, physical and spiritual, was interconnected. For the Egyptians, animals were not just creatures that walked the earth, they were integral to the cosmic order and played vital roles in maintaining harmony between the worlds of the living and the dead. This holistic view of the world helped shape how the Egyptians lived and how they interacted with the natural world. From their architectural marvels to their artistic expressions, the reverence for animals was deeply embedded in their culture. The idea of eating a dog, or any animal that held spiritual significance, would have been seen as a violation of the sacred order. In this sense, the Egyptians were not just spiritually connected to animals, they were bound by a moral and cosmic responsibility to protect and honor them. As we look at the role dogs played in Egyptian society, it's clear that their reverence went far beyond the physical. They were seen as divine creatures with the power to guide souls to the afterlife. And because of this sacred status, they were never to be consumed. Instead, they were to be honored and respected as guardians of the divine balance. In the end, the Egyptians' relationship with dogs was about much more than companionship. It was about maintaining harmony between the living and the spiritual world. Their belief in the sacredness of dogs shaped their diet, their rituals, and their entire worldview. And as we continue to explore the fascinating history of Egypt, we see that this reverence for animals played a central role in the way they shaped their society and their understanding of the divine. We've now covered the spiritual significance of dogs in ancient Egypt, but let's take a moment to zoom out and consider the broader cultural implications of how animals were treated and how this influenced Egyptian society as a whole. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian culture is how their belief system was reflected in their daily practices, especially in terms of animal treatment and the social hierarchy. The ancient Egyptians were keenly aware of the interconnectedness of the world around them, and this awareness extended to the role that animals played in maintaining social order. As we've seen, animals like dogs were not just seen as companions or even protectors, they were symbols of something much bigger: divine order, spiritual protection, and even the balance of the universe itself. In this way, animals were intricately tied to Egypt's hierarchy, from the common people to the pharaohs. For the Egyptians, animals had roles beyond just being food or pets. They were symbols of power and protection, and this was reflected in how they were treated within different social classes. In Egyptian society, animals like dogs were not reserved for the elite alone, they were important for people from all walks of life. While the pharaohs might have had elaborate tombs with dogs buried alongside them, commoners also recognized the importance of these animals as guardians and protectors. The spiritual role of dogs in Egyptian society was democratized to some extent, meaning that they were revered by all levels of society, regardless of social standing. The connection between animals and the spiritual realm also influenced the ways in which animals were used in rituals and festivals. Dogs, along with other animals like cats, bulls, and crocodiles, were often included in religious ceremonies meant to honor the gods or ensure protection in the afterlife. These animals were believed to have special powers or connections to the divine, and their presence in rituals was thought to bring blessings or spiritual power. Take, for example, the annual festivals honoring the gods. During these events, animals were often sacrificed or ritually included to ensure that the gods were pleased and would bestow their favor on the living. While many animals were used in these sacrifices, dogs held a particularly important position. Their role in the afterlife, and their connection to gods like Anubis, meant they were viewed as essential to the spiritual well-being of the community. This wasn't about consumption, it was about ensuring that the gods and spirits were honored, and that the divine order was maintained. As we move into the later periods of Egyptian history, it becomes clear that the reverence for animals like dogs did not diminish. In fact, it continued to shape Egyptian culture even as the civilization evolved. The influence of spiritual beliefs on the treatment of animals extended into the arts, where dogs continued to be depicted as loyal companions and protectors. In tombs and temples, dogs were shown by the side of their owners, guarding them in life and death. The idea of loyalty and protection was central to the image of dogs in Egyptian culture. These animals were seen as steadfast and unyielding, qualities that were highly valued in both human and animal relationships. In many ways, dogs were the epitome of what the Egyptians sought in their spiritual and societal order: unwavering loyalty, a sense of duty, and protection from the forces of chaos. But let's take a step back and consider the practical side of things. The Egyptians, as we've discussed, were far from naive when it came to survival. They were farmers, traders, and builders, and their success depended on their ability to work with the natural world. While they had great respect for animals, they were also pragmatic. They didn't hesitate to use animals for labor, food, or other practical purposes when needed. But the key distinction was this: when it came to animals with sacred roles, such as dogs, their spiritual importance was prioritized over any practical concerns. This idea was not unique to Egypt. Many ancient cultures had similar views of animals, where spiritual or symbolic significance was placed above their role as a food source. However, what set Egypt apart was the depth of their religious beliefs and the way in which these beliefs were woven into every aspect of their daily lives, including their treatment of animals. When you compare Egypt's relationship with dogs to that of other civilizations, you start to see the differences in how animals were regarded. In places like ancient Greece and Rome, animals were more utilitarian. While dogs were respected as companions and protectors, they didn't carry the same spiritual weight that they did in Egypt. In fact, some Roman texts even mention the consumption of dog meat, particularly during times of famine or economic hardship. This pragmatic approach was in stark contrast to the Egyptians' sacred view of dogs, and it highlights the cultural differences between these civilizations. In Egypt, the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds was inseparable. The world around them was alive with divine presence, and animals were seen as integral to maintaining the harmony of that world. This belief in the sanctity of animals, particularly dogs, shaped not only their dietary choices but also their societal values and practices. For the Egyptians, eating a dog was not just a matter of personal taste or survival, it was an act of violating the divine order that governed their world. As we've explored, the Egyptians' reverence for dogs was just one aspect of a broader cultural framework that placed great importance on the spiritual significance of animals. This framework helped shape Egyptian society in profound ways, from their religious practices to their social structures. It was a worldview that saw the divine in all things: animals, nature, the heavens, and the earth, and it's a worldview that continues to captivate us to this day. Historians may continue to debate the exact reasons why the Egyptians never ate dogs, but what is clear is that the sacred role of dogs in Egyptian culture had a lasting impact on how they were treated and revered. Dogs were protectors, companions, and spiritual guides, and for the Egyptians, they were far too important to ever become a meal. As we've seen, the Egyptian worldview was deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs, particularly when it came to the role animals played in their society. The sacred status of dogs was part of a much larger cultural framework that influenced not just their dietary choices, but also how they viewed the balance of nature and the divine. But as we come to the end of our exploration into the ancient Egyptians' relationship with dogs, let's take a step back and consider how these beliefs have shaped our modern perspectives, both in Egypt and around the world. In modern times, the perception of dogs has undergone a massive transformation. Whereas the ancient Egyptians saw them as spiritual guardians, companions, and protectors, today dogs are often viewed primarily as pets or even family members in many cultures. The reverence for dogs in Egypt, rooted in their role as divine creatures, may seem far removed from the way we view them today. However, echoes of that ancient respect can still be seen in how many people around the world treat their dogs. For instance, in Egyptian culture today, dogs still hold a special place, but the spiritual and symbolic significance has largely faded. They're primarily seen as loyal companions, much like in other parts of the world. Yet, the connection to Egypt's deep historical reverence for dogs is still there, though now more in the form of cultural pride and historical memory rather than a belief in their divine status. Many Egyptians still keep dogs as pets, and in some rural areas, dogs continue to serve practical purposes, such as guarding homes and livestock, but the ancient belief that dogs are protectors of the soul has long since been relegated to history. Looking beyond Egypt, the question of eating dogs has become a contentious issue in modern societies. In many Western countries, the idea of eating dog meat is not only taboo but repugnant. This view is largely shaped by cultural and historical factors, particularly the deep emotional connection many people have with dogs as companions. The relationship between humans and dogs has evolved, and in most parts of the world today, dogs are seen as part of the family. The idea of eating a dog, then, is almost unthinkable to most people in these cultures, and this has influenced laws, ethics, and even animal rights movements. However, in other parts of the world, the consumption of dog meat still persists, often tied to traditions, rituals, or even survival. For example, in parts of Asia, particularly South Korea and China, dog meat has been eaten for centuries, often associated with festivals or believed to have health benefits. While these practices are rapidly changing due to growing animal rights awareness and changing attitudes toward dogs, they still persist in some areas. In countries where dog meat consumption is common, the reasons for eating dogs often have cultural, economic, or practical roots, rather than a belief in their sacred role as seen in ancient Egypt. Interestingly, the rise of animal rights movements in the modern world has brought attention to the ethical implications of eating dogs. Advocacy for the humane treatment of animals, particularly companion animals like dogs, has led to a global conversation about how we treat animals and whether it's acceptable to consume them. These debates are often framed by the deep emotional bonds people have with their pets, as well as the growing recognition of animals as sentient beings with the right to be treated with respect and dignity. In many ways, the ancient Egyptians' reverence for dogs has shaped our modern views on animals. They were the first to elevate dogs to a divine status, and in doing so, they set a precedent for how many cultures would come to view their role in society. The idea of a dog as a spiritual protector, guardian of the dead, and guide to the afterlife may seem like a distant memory, but it remains embedded in the cultural fabric of modern society. Even if we no longer believe that dogs are intermediaries between life and death, many people still recognize their unique role as loyal companions who offer unconditional love and protection. As we consider the enduring legacy of the ancient Egyptians, we can see how their beliefs continue to influence how we treat animals today. The reverence for dogs may have faded, but it hasn't disappeared completely. Instead, it has evolved into a different kind of reverence, one that recognizes the emotional and spiritual bond between humans and dogs, even if we no longer view them as divine creatures. Historians and anthropologists continue to study the relationship between humans and animals, and the story of the Egyptians and their sacred dogs remains a fascinating chapter in this ongoing exploration. By examining the ways in which ancient cultures revered animals, we can better understand how our modern attitudes have been shaped and how we can continue to improve our treatment of animals in the future. As we wrap up this exploration of the ancient Egyptians and their unique relationship with dogs, it's clear that their belief in the sacredness of animals had a profound impact on their culture and society. Dogs, in particular, held a place of honor and reverence that transcended their role as pets or companions. To the Egyptians, they were spiritual guides, guardians of the afterlife, and symbols of divine protection. While the world has changed, the legacy of this ancient reverence lives on, reminding us of the deep connections that humans share with the animals around them. As we reflect on the enduring legacy of the ancient Egyptians' relationship with dogs, it's clear that the significance they attached to animals, particularly dogs, goes far beyond the physical or practical. The reverence for dogs in Egypt offers us a glimpse into a culture that viewed the natural world not only as a place of sustenance and survival, but also as a divine system in which every being played a vital, interconnected role. In this framework, dogs were not merely animals, they were agents of spiritual power, standing guard at the crossroads of life and death. This brings us to a fascinating question. How did the sacred status of dogs in ancient Egypt compare to other animals that were revered in the same way? The Egyptians had a wide array of sacred animals, each with its own spiritual symbolism. For instance, the cat, which we now often associate with being a beloved pet, was another animal of immense spiritual importance in Egypt. Cats were revered for their grace and hunting abilities, and they were associated with the goddess Batet, the goddess of home, fertility, and protection. Much like dogs, cats were seen as protectors of the home and were even mummified and buried with their owners. Interestingly, however, despite the cat's prominent place in Egyptian mythology and daily life, they didn't share the same profound, otherworldly connection that dogs had to the afterlife. Cats were seen as protectors of the physical realm, keeping evil spirits and pests at bay. They were also sacred to the goddess who was part of the cycle of life and fertility, but they didn't have the same ritual significance tied to spiritual journeys beyond death as dogs did. In this sense, dogs had a unique position within Egyptian spiritual beliefs, acting as literal guides to the afterlife, whereas cats were more aligned with the protection of the home and the living. It's also important to note that other animals, such as bulls, falcons, and crocodiles, were deeply symbolic in Egyptian culture, yet they did not share the same role as the dog in terms of spiritual protection during the journey to the afterlife. For example, the bull was a symbol of strength and fertility and was often associated with gods like Apis, while the crocodile was revered due to its connection with Sobek, the god of water and fertility. However, unlike dogs, which had an intimate connection with Anubis, the god of the dead, these animals were more closely tied to specific deities and aspects of daily life rather than the afterlife itself. This contrast in roles, dogs as spiritual guides for the deceased, while other animals had different divine connections, helped cement the dog's unique status in Egyptian society. It wasn't just that dogs were spiritually important, it was the fact that they were linked to the fundamental Egyptian belief in maintaining harmony between the living and the dead. They had a role that transcended mere companionship and was embedded in the very process of dying and the journey beyond. As we consider the shift in how dogs are viewed in modern society, it's interesting to see the parallels between how dogs were revered in ancient Egypt and how they are viewed today. While the sacred status of dogs may have faded over the centuries, the emotional and spiritual bond between humans and dogs remains as strong as ever. In many ways, dogs have retained their place as loyal protectors, guardians, and companions in the lives of their human families. However, it's also worth noting that as time passed and the ancient Egyptian civilization gave way to others, the cultural practices surrounding animals evolved. The reverence for dogs, though it persisted in various forms across different civilizations, did not always carry the same spiritual weight. In some cultures, as we've seen with the Greeks and Romans, dogs were valued for their utility as hunters or guards, but their spiritual significance was largely absent. In modern times, while dogs are still cherished companions, their spiritual or divine associations are generally not part of most societies' worldview. This shift is a fascinating one, and it serves as a reminder of how cultural, spiritual, and societal values change over time. The ancient Egyptians saw animals, particularly dogs, as integral to their understanding of the cosmos. In contrast, our modern relationship with dogs has become more focused on companionship, affection, and loyalty rather than their role in the spiritual realm. Yet, the bond remains undeniable. Dogs are still seen by many as family members, protectors, and even healers. It's also interesting to consider how this evolution in the way we view dogs reflects broader changes in our relationship with nature and spirituality. While the Egyptians maintained a belief in the sacredness of the natural world, modern society often views animals more through a lens of scientific observation and personal affection. The sacred has given way to the emotional, and while this shift reflects a different approach to spirituality, it doesn't lessen the bond we share with dogs. In fact, the emotional and spiritual connection between humans and dogs may actually reflect some of the same principles that the Egyptians held dear. Just as they believed dogs were protectors of the soul, modern people often find solace in their dog's companionship, especially during times of emotional distress or physical illness. Dogs have a unique ability to provide unconditional love and loyalty, qualities that continue to resonate with us in ways that transcend time. As we reflect on the ancient Egyptians and their reverence for dogs, it's clear that their relationship with these animals was part of a broader spiritual and cultural framework that intertwined the physical and the divine. Dogs were not just companions, they were guides through life and death, protectors of the soul, and symbols of the harmony that existed between the living and the dead. This unique perspective on dogs and their role in the afterlife offers us valuable insights into the spiritual beliefs of the ancient Egyptians and their deep connection to the natural world. Today, while the spiritual significance of dogs may have evolved, the bond remains as strong as ever. And perhaps, in some small way, the ancient reverence for these animals continues to shape the way we view them, loyal companions, protectors, and friends. As we continue our reflection on the lasting legacy of ancient Egypt's reverence for dogs, let's delve deeper into how the evolution of these beliefs has shaped our current understanding of the human-animal bond. The ancient Egyptians' deep spiritual connection with dogs wasn't just about religious rituals or protecting the soul in the afterlife, it was about how these animals embodied certain virtues that the Egyptians held dear. Loyalty, protection, guidance, and a connection to the divine, these qualities made dogs invaluable in Egyptian society. It's easy to see how these same virtues still resonate with us today. Dogs are often regarded as symbols of loyalty and protection, whether they're serving as guard dogs, therapy animals, or beloved family pets. The qualities that made dogs so sacred in ancient Egypt, those that tied them to the divine, are qualities that continue to make them incredibly special to us. But unlike the ancient Egyptians, we no longer believe that dogs serve as intermediaries between life and death. However, they continue to hold an esteemed place in our hearts as companions who offer unconditional love, protection, and emotional support. What makes this bond so powerful? How have our modern relationships with dogs been shaped by the ancient Egyptians' reverence for them? One of the main ways this influence manifests is in how we perceive the emotional and spiritual role that dogs play in our lives. The Egyptians saw dogs as protectors of the soul, ensuring that the journey to the afterlife was safe. In much the same way, dogs today are often seen as protectors of the spirit, offering comfort and companionship during times of loneliness, stress, or grief. The act of having a dog as a companion is, in many ways, an extension of that ancient belief that dogs have the power to protect and guide us, albeit in a more emotional, psychological sense rather than a spiritual one. Dogs have also become central figures in modern therapeutic practices, particularly in the realm of emotional and mental health. Service dogs, therapy dogs, and emotional support dogs play vital roles in helping people cope with everything from anxiety and depression to PTSD and autism. Their ability to sense emotional distress and offer comfort is a testament to the deep bond between humans and dogs. While the Egyptians believed that dogs had a spiritual role in guiding souls, today's dogs are still guiding us, this time, through the labyrinth of our emotions. In a world that often feels disconnected from the natural and spiritual realms, dogs serve as a reminder of the deeper connections we can have with animals. Just as the ancient Egyptians saw the dog as a protector of both the physical and spiritual realms, we continue to see dogs as protectors, albeit in ways that speak to our modern needs for emotional support, companionship, and connection. The idea that a dog can help heal emotional wounds, calm anxieties, and provide unconditional love mirrors the role that dogs played in Egyptian society as protectors of the soul and guardians of balance. Beyond emotional support, the modern bond between humans and dogs also highlights the importance of empathy and mutual care. Just as the Egyptians cared for their dogs in life and death, ensuring they had a place in the afterlife, we too care for our dogs in a similar way. We ensure their well-being through veterinary care, provide them with comfortable homes, and offer them affection and attention. In return, dogs give us loyalty, companionship, and emotional stability. The love we share with dogs is an exchange that mirrors the Egyptians' ancient understanding of the connection between humans and animals. It's a partnership built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. In many ways, our modern-day reverence for dogs isn't so different from that of the ancient Egyptians. While the spiritual aspect may have faded, the emotional connection has only grown stronger. The qualities that made dogs sacred to the Egyptians, loyalty, protection, guidance, and companionship, are qualities that we still seek in our canine companions today. And as we continue to evolve in our understanding of animals and their place in our lives, it's clear that the reverence the Egyptians had for dogs wasn't just about religious belief. It was about recognizing the essential role that animals play in our emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. As we continue to explore the ancient Egyptians' reverence for dogs, it's important to recognize how this deep spiritual bond between humans and dogs transcends time. While we may not view dogs as divine protectors of the afterlife today, the love and loyalty they offer remain unchanged. The ancient Egyptians' reverence for dogs was an acknowledgement of their profound emotional and spiritual power, an understanding that we still carry with us today, whether we consciously realize it or not. So, in the end, the legacy of ancient Egypt's sacred bond with dogs is not just about how they viewed these animals in the context of their religious rituals or afterlife beliefs. It's about how those values continue to shape our understanding of the human-animal relationship in the modern world. Dogs, in many ways, continue to embody the qualities that the Egyptians revered: loyalty, protection, and a deep emotional connection. Whether they are guarding our homes or providing comfort during times of hardship, dogs remain steadfast companions, much like they were for the ancient Egyptians. And as long as we continue to honor these bonds, we keep their ancient reverence alive. As we draw closer to the end of our journey through the world of ancient Egypt and its profound relationship with dogs, it's essential to consider the broader cultural implications of this sacred bond and how it has resonated throughout history. The reverence that Egyptians held for dogs wasn't just about keeping their physical homes safe or ensuring spiritual protection in the afterlife. It was about a holistic worldview that intertwined the divine with the everyday. Their perspective on animals, especially dogs, was integral to the way they saw life, death, and everything in between. In many ways, this perspective was a reflection of the Egyptians' deeply spiritual approach to life itself. Unlike modern societies that often separate the physical from the spiritual, the Egyptians believed that everything was interconnected. The natural world wasn't just a place where humans lived, it was a sacred, living reflection of the divine. Animals, as part of this natural world, were seen as physical manifestations of spiritual forces, each fulfilling a divine purpose. Dogs, in particular, were regarded as protectors, not just of the home, but of the soul. They bridged the gap between life and death, providing not only physical security but also spiritual guidance. This idea of interconnectedness extended to the Egyptian view of the afterlife. The Egyptians didn't view death as an end, but as a transition to another phase of existence. The role that dogs played in this transition was crucial. Just as they provided physical protection during the living years, they were believed to protect the soul in its journey to the afterlife. This belief was so deeply embedded in Egyptian culture that dogs were often buried alongside their masters, ensuring that they would continue to protect them in the next life. This wasn't just a practical measure, it was a deeply spiritual act, one that acknowledged the unbreakable bond between human and animal, living and dead. Now, let's consider how the legacy of this worldview has shaped modern practices and beliefs about dogs and animals in general. While our relationship with dogs may have evolved over millennia, the essence of their sacred status remains in the way we treat them today. In many cultures, dogs are still seen as loyal companions, guardians, and friends. In fact, the idea of a dog as a protector of the soul might have faded from most modern belief systems, but the deep emotional and spiritual bond between humans and dogs persists. The modern world may not view dogs as divine beings tied to the afterlife, but we still view them as sacred in their own way. Dogs have a unique ability to connect with humans emotionally and psychologically, offering unconditional love and comfort. This ability to provide emotional support in a way that transcends basic companionship is why dogs are still considered special members of the family in many cultures today. Whether through therapy, service work, or simply as companions, dogs continue to provide us with the protection, loyalty, and guidance that the Egyptians once believed they offered in the spiritual realm. In fact, the modern role of dogs in emotional and psychological healing is perhaps the closest we've come to replicating their ancient role as spiritual protectors. Dogs have been shown to reduce stress, alleviate anxiety, and provide comfort to those who are suffering from mental or emotional challenges. While the Egyptians might have seen dogs as divine guides to the afterlife, today, they are seen as guardians of our emotional well-being. This shift from a physical and spiritual protector to an emotional one is a natural evolution of the bond humans have shared with dogs for millennia. But even beyond their role as emotional protectors, dogs still maintain a place of great significance in our lives. From their roles in law enforcement and military service to their presence in homes as companions, dogs continue to serve in ways that benefit both individuals and society. Their loyalty and bravery make them valuable assets in fields ranging from search and rescue operations to providing companionship for the elderly. While the context has changed, the essence of what makes a dog special remains unchanged: their unwavering devotion to those they care for. Looking back, the ancient Egyptians' reverence for dogs was not just about honoring an animal, it was about recognizing the profound connection between the physical world and the spiritual world. Dogs were seen as mediators of that connection, bridging the gap between life and death, the living and the divine. They were protectors, guides, and companions, and their role in Egyptian society was essential to maintaining harmony and balance in the universe. As we move into the present day, we can still see echoes of this ancient reverence in the way we treat dogs. Though their spiritual significance may no longer be as prominent, their role as loyal, loving companions remains as essential as ever. In a world that often feels disconnected from the deeper, spiritual aspects of life, dogs continue to provide us with a sense of connection, loyalty, and unconditional love. Perhaps, in that sense, the ancient Egyptians' reverence for dogs wasn't just an acknowledgement of their divine status, it was a recognition of the unique bond between humans and animals, a bond that continues to endure. So, as we reflect on the ancient Egyptians and their deep respect for dogs, let's consider how that respect has shaped our modern understanding of these incredible animals. From ancient protectors of the soul to modern-day companions, dogs continue to play an important role in our lives, offering us loyalty, protection, and love. In that way, the legacy of Egypt's reverence for dogs lives on, even if it's no longer framed in the spiritual terms it once was. The bond between humans and dogs is timeless, and in many ways, it remains as sacred today as it was thousands of years ago. As we continue to reflect on the legacy of ancient Egypt's reverence for dogs, it's important to recognize that this reverence was not just about spirituality and symbolism. It was also a reflection of how the ancient Egyptians viewed the role of animals in maintaining balance within their world. They understood that the relationship between humans and animals was reciprocal, both needed each other to survive, to thrive, and to maintain harmony in the natural and spiritual realms. In a sense, the Egyptians were ahead of their time. Their deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all living beings created a society where animals were not simply seen as resources, but as essential partners in life's journey. This is a view that, to this day, remains somewhat revolutionary. Even as we have advanced in technology, culture, and philosophy, the idea that animals, especially dogs, are spiritual beings deserving of respect and care still holds weight in many parts of the world. Take, for instance, the idea of animal rights, which has gained considerable traction in the modern world. While the ancient Egyptians didn't have the language of animal rights as we understand it today, their belief in the sacredness of animals like dogs effectively set the groundwork for the moral arguments we make today. The recognition that animals have intrinsic value, not just for the physical roles they play in our lives, but for the spiritual and emotional roles they fulfill, was a principle that the Egyptians lived by. And in many ways, it's a principle we are rediscovering as we continue to push for better treatment and understanding of animals. The bond between humans and dogs is a powerful example of this. In ancient Egypt, dogs were seen as more than just animals, they were partners in both the physical and spiritual sense. Their role in society was far-reaching, they were protectors, companions, and guides. They represented the connection between the mortal world and the divine. Today, dogs still embody many of these qualities, though their role has evolved. While they may no longer be viewed as divine beings that guide souls to the afterlife, they continue to protect, guide, and offer companionship in ways that help humans navigate their physical and emotional lives. In fact, modern science has shown just how much dogs influence human well-being. Studies have demonstrated that spending time with dogs can reduce stress, lower blood pressure, and even improve overall mental health. This scientific understanding of the emotional and physical benefits of dog companionship is a reflection of the same intuitive understanding the Egyptians had, that the bond between humans and dogs is not just practical, but deeply meaningful. It's worth noting that this bond isn't just an ancient cultural phenomenon, it's universal. Across cultures and time periods, dogs have been seen as symbols of loyalty, protection, and unconditional love. Whether in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, or modern times, the role of the dog has remained relatively constant. They have been, and continue to be, steadfast companions who offer their loyalty and affection without question. In this way, dogs serve as a reminder of the virtues that transcend time, loyalty, love, and protection. And while we may no longer view them as spiritual guides to the afterlife, their role in our lives is no less significant. As we consider the global perspective on dogs, we see that their role in our lives varies greatly depending on culture and geography. In some places, like the United States and Western Europe, dogs are treated as family members, and their presence is often linked to a person's emotional well-being. In other parts of the world, dogs may still be seen primarily as working animals, fulfilling roles like herding, guarding, or assisting in law enforcement. However, no matter the role they play, one thing remains constant: dogs have a unique ability to form deep emotional connections with humans. This universal bond between humans and dogs speaks to something profound and deeply human. Dogs, in their loyalty and love, offer something that no other animal can. They are the ultimate companions, offering not just physical protection, but emotional and psychological support. The Egyptians recognized this quality in their dogs thousands of years ago, and today, we continue to see it in the way we treat and care for our canine companions. The ancient Egyptians' reverence for dogs serves as a testament to the deep bond that has existed between humans and animals throughout history. While our relationship with dogs has evolved, their role as loyal companions, protectors, and guardians of our emotional well-being remains unchanged. In many ways, we are still living out the values the Egyptians held dear: a recognition of the intrinsic worth of animals, and a deep understanding of the importance of the bond we share with them. In reflecting on this, it's clear that the Egyptians were not simply honoring dogs for their usefulness or their loyalty; they were recognizing them as sacred beings, essential to the balance of life. In this way, their reverence for dogs goes far beyond what we typically associate with ancient cultures and beliefs. The spiritual connection they saw between humans and animals is a lesson we can still carry with us today. Dogs continue to be a reminder of the importance of loyalty, love, and connection, not just to each other, but to the world around us. The reverence the Egyptians had for dogs reminds us that our relationship with animals is not just about what they can do for us; it's about recognizing the deep, intrinsic value they hold. As we move forward in a world that continues to change, let's take a moment to remember the ancient wisdom that teaches us to honor the animals who have shared our world for millennia. And in doing so, we honor not just their role in our lives, but the sacred bond we share with them, a bond that has endured, unchanged, for thousands of years. As we come to the final section of our journey through the sacred bond between the ancient Egyptians and their dogs, let's pause for a moment to reflect on the deeper implications of their worldview. The ancient Egyptians' relationship with dogs was not just about respect for animals; it was a reflection of how they saw the world itself. Their belief in the interconnectedness of all things, including humans and animals, was a core tenet of their spirituality, and it helped shape a society that was rich in symbolism, ritual, and a deep understanding of the natural and divine forces at work in their lives. The Egyptians' reverence for dogs was a reflection of their larger view of the world. They didn't see themselves as separate from nature or the divine; they saw themselves as part of a larger cosmic order. This order was maintained not just by the gods, but by the animals that were part of it. Dogs were more than just companions; they were divine agents that helped maintain the balance between life and death, between the living and the spiritual world. Their role as protectors, guides, and loyal companions was integral to this belief system. This view of the world, where every creature, no matter how seemingly insignificant, had a divine purpose, was central to Egyptian society. The dog's role in this system was as a spiritual intermediary, a being that could bridge the gap between life and the afterlife. This belief wasn't just theoretical; it was lived out in every aspect of Egyptian life, from their burial practices to their daily rituals. Dogs were revered as sacred beings, and their role in the afterlife was a reflection of their importance in the living world. But even beyond their spiritual significance, dogs played a very practical role in Egyptian society. They were used for hunting, protection, and even companionship. The Egyptians understood the value of loyalty and protection, and they valued dogs for these qualities. Their deep connection to these animals was not just spiritual, it was also rooted in practical, everyday concerns. Dogs were protectors of the home, guardians of the tomb, and companions who provided comfort and security. In many ways, the relationship between the Egyptians and their dogs mirrors the relationship we share with animals today. While the spiritual significance may have faded, the emotional bond remains strong. Dogs are still seen as loyal companions, protectors, and friends, though now we view them more as family members than spiritual guides. The essence of what made dogs so important to the Egyptians is still present in our relationship with them today. They provide us with comfort, companionship, and a sense of security, much like they did for the ancient Egyptians. As we reflect on this, we can also recognize that our modern treatment of dogs is shaped by the values and beliefs that have been passed down through history. The Egyptians' reverence for dogs helped to set the stage for how we view them today, not just as pets, but as companions who offer us emotional and physical support. In a world that often feels disconnected from the spiritual and natural realms, dogs continue to offer us a tangible connection to something deeper. The legacy of the ancient Egyptians' reverence for dogs is not just about how they viewed these animals thousands of years ago, it's about how their worldview shaped the way we think about animals and our relationship with them today. The Egyptians saw dogs as sacred beings, capable of bridging the gap between life and death. While our understanding of dogs may not be as spiritual, we still recognize their profound ability to touch our lives in ways that go beyond the physical. Dogs continue to provide us with loyalty, love, and protection, just as they did for the ancient Egyptians. As we conclude this journey, it's clear that the bond between humans and dogs is timeless. It transcends cultures, religions, and centuries. Whether we see them as spiritual guides, companions, or family members, dogs have remained steadfast in their role as protectors of our hearts and souls. The ancient Egyptians understood this bond in a way that still resonates with us today, reminding us that our relationship with animals is not just about what they can do for us, but about the deep connection we share with them. So, as we step back into the modern world, let's carry with us the lessons of the past. Let's remember the reverence the ancient Egyptians had for dogs, and how that reverence was a reflection of their larger understanding of the world, one where animals were not just creatures to be used, but sacred beings with an important role to play in maintaining the balance of the universe. While our relationship with dogs may look different today, the essence of that bond remains unchanged. And in that timeless connection, we find a deeper understanding of the world and our place in it.